Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the All Saints podcast. I have the distinct privilege today of having with me in the studio Pastor Kip Chelashaw, old friend of mine. We've known each other since 2005. We met at seminary. Maybe we bumped into each other before that.
Probably.
But Pastor Chelashaw is the pastor of Christ Church in Loresho, which is a suburb of Nairobi, Kenya.
That's right.
And we've had the chance of meeting up again for the first time in years since before my family and I moved here to the US. Just this last week when Kip was over here for the CREC Council and Presbyteries meeting in Moscow, Idaho. So we got to hang out there. He got to introduce himself to a bunch of the CREC guys. He gave a presentation about the work in Kenya. And then here at All Saints, just yesterday, October the 1st, we had Kip, as well as another guest who I'm going to have on the podcast either last week or next week, depending on which order I do these interviews in. We had Pastor Jan Prorok with us, and we had a chance to get to know you both. But it was really too little time to get to know you both. And so I'm conscious that folks in the congregation here had questions that they weren't able to ask. And it may be that for those of you who are watching this or listening to this who are not at All Saints, you'd be interested to hear about the ministry of a church that is very like-minded with ours in a very different part of the world. So what I'm keen to do, Kip, if I may, is, well, first, why don't you just sketch the background to the church, your family, and so on, just so that people who don't know you have a sense of where you're coming from. Then I want to get into some of the very practical discipleship issues that you've been talking about. So your background, your family, the church you're in, and so on.
Great. So let me do myself briefly. So I'm Kip, as you heard, Kip Chelashaw, married to the lovely Rachel. She's lovely. She's amazing. And we have 4 children, ranging from 12 to 6. 2 boys, upper and older, than two girls. And by the grace of God, we were able to move to Nairobi, which is where I was brought up. So I lived in Nairobi until 21, then went to the UK for about 20 years, then moved back in 2017 and worked or served a little bit with a small church for 2-3 years. Then from November 2020, we planted a church very much in the mold of the CREC. And by God's grace, that's been going generally okay. We'll be coming up this November to 3 years. But it's been amazing and grown in ways in which we hadn't expected, especially seeing lots of children. We if I'm honest, we were hoping we'd have, because we've been told, try and get the middle classes. They're going to be the culture shapers, but God's ways are higher than and better than our ways.
Yeah. Children
en masse have come and been part of the church there.
So tell us about that. You've got a congregation, and Loresho is on the border between the kind of middle-class enclave that Western expats might go and live in if they were seconded to Nairobi with their work, and the other side of the kind of unofficial boundary is a slum.
That's right.
And so in one sense, you're in a great position, and notwithstanding all the sociologists who will tell you that the culture shapers are the rich people, it turns out the culture shapers are the children.
Indeed.
If you're willing to wait long enough for them to grow in years and, by God's grace, in maturity. So tell us a little bit. You've got 2 congregations. You've got your church congregation, and then you've got. So tell us about that.
So what happened is when we began, very much as I think the Bible shows us, when the church gathers together, we should be all ages, all backgrounds, and we intended it that way. But we've not been able to find a venue. We're meeting in our home. And we began in November 2020. By the January, I remember, first Sunday in January 2021, about 7-8 months later, we were clocking about 150, and at least 100 of those were kids from the local slum. And so largely, not because we want to, but because of space issues and wanting others to come for the service, we encouraged those kids from the slum to come for a Sunday school, get their Bible knowledge up, as it were. So they come from about 8:30 until 10. And then the service from 10:30 till about midday. And that work amongst the children has grown, hugely. We began with about 6-7 children. I've got 4, so most of the Sunday school kids were mine. But now I didn't actually check what they were this yesterday, but we've been in the 130s, 140s. On a good Sunday, we're clocking 150 children coming to Sunday school. So God has, as you say, we had a certain view what we would like to see, and some of those would be people we considered our friends, but God has just opened the door in a different direction. And I think you're right. We have to just think long term.
Right. Now, what I was most interested about, we've talked obviously over the years, we've Zoomed and Skyped and FaceTimed and everything else, just catching up. And it struck me during the years and also in our conversations this last couple of days that there are some discipleship issues that you have in Nairobi with the adults, the young couples, the single people, and with the children, which in one sense are very distinctively shaped by the Kenyan culture.
Yeah.
But in another sense, they're very much a version of the same issues that we have here at All Saints. They're the same sorts of things that I was leading people through in London. I think they're probably the same issues that people have everywhere. And I would just love to hear you talk about those. So we've got the children,
Yeah.
we've got the adults, some married couples. And so this is not about dishing the dirt on individuals. This is about trends and the big picture, you know.
Yeah, that's true.
So where do you want to start? Do you want to start with the children or the adults?
We can start with the children.
Yeah.
And they all really connect in one sense. So children, we have about, say on a good Sunday, 150 maybe, or just under that. Normal Sundays, 120, 130. The children from the slum, those 130, none of them come from homes where their parents are together or have been properly married.
Right.
Zero.
Literally not one.
There's none. And so when I actually, I don't know whether I've mentioned this to you, when I ask people to pray, one of the things we're praying long term is for at least one or two of those children to stick long enough with us and then to properly get married.
Right.
That would be so powerful.
Right. So they're going to be thinking about the relationships that they're going to be developing with members of the opposite sex, but they're going to be thinking about it covenantally and biblically.
That's right. As opposed to, so when we began, we did a relationship thing with, I did it with the guys, Rachel did with the ladies, and she asked them, well, in one of the opening sessions, what are you looking for in a guy? And basically, one of the girls said she would like a guy who drives a 4-wheel drive. That was her first criteria.
Because that's
security. Kind of, you've come from the slum, and actually, and then I've done a general one, and I was amazed how not one of them. I do it anonymously. Just write 2 or 3 things you're looking for. The first time I did it, as a whole group, no one put item number 1 as a believer. Nobody.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, one person I remember, and I said, "What does this mean?" One person put a God-fearer.
Okay.
They just read it. But I was like, guys, you ought to be intentionally saying, I want someone who believes in Christ, follows Christ. And not in the vague sense, not they say they come to church once in a while, but you can see evidence in their life of a commitment to Christ.
Right.
So you could pray for that. You know, these children who, in one sense, it's not of their doing. You're really facing a world that is chaotic and unstable, and usually, if the parents are together, they're not married. If there's any parent at all, majority are women. The dads have just abandoned them. So pray on that we it's only we're Rich and I the oldest couple, but it'd be lovely to have other couples who can model what it is they should be aspiring to. Godly spouse on both, either man, women, and then people who are committed to Christ in word and deed, and are wanting to walk the way of Christ in every area of their life. As opposed to just like, I'm from the slum, I want to get someone who lives in a nice neighborhood and has got money and I'll be sorted for life, which is where they tend to default to.
Right. So you've got, in one way or another, an abandonment of, or just no awareness of, biblical wisdom and biblical norms about who's going to be a good mum and wife, who's going to be a good father to my children and a good husband.
That's right.
And so in a sense then, the worldly aspirations have been sucked in to fill that vacuum.
They have been.
And
obviously, at one level, I sympathize. I was very privileged. Parents, mum and dad at home. My mum was very devoted and trained us. They've not had any of that. So at a human, base level, everyone wants stability and goodness, and they've not had that. So you sympathize, but ultimately, obviously, they've not experienced it, seen it. They ought to be seeking Christ first, but that's what we were kind of trying to encourage and remind. And then in terms of just ongoing ministry, it means we are having to do relationship stuff a lot, and it feels a bit painful because you're having to repeat stuff.
Yes.
You're having to repeat.
How many times do I have to say this to you?
How many times do I have to say this? I thought we talked about it last month, and I've just asked you in a hidden way, and you've still given me answers that are not. So we've got to go. It really feels with the children, actually, a lot of the discipleship, like parenting. Just repeating. You know how with the children, you want them to sit nice at the table, you want them to hold the cutlery nicely. You're just having to go, it's like, guys, say please. And we're finding that at the discipleship level of, what to look out for, what to expect, that kind of thing.
So it's interesting as I think about the situation we have here in All Saints. We do have some people who are adults who have grown up in contexts where they really didn't have anything like a good Christian role model. So it'd be good to talk about that in a few minutes when you talk about the adults.
Yes.
But just thinking about the young people and the children, I think we have a slightly different version of the danger here. So the young people who are in our church here at All Saints, and the young people who are in most of our churches in our communion, the CREC, are there because they do have Christian parents. Now, some of those Christian parents would themselves say that they've got some regrets about their past immaturities and their failings, but they're here. I mean, their parents are in church, and for the vast majority of them, not all, but the vast majority, they've got both parents, and even if there has been a divorce and a remarriage, there's a loving mum and stepdad, or step mum and a father.
Yes.
So the danger here, it seems to me, subtly different. It's not that our young people have never experienced the fruit of Christian, covenantally oriented, faithful marriage. It's that they have experienced it, and the danger is that we come to take it for granted. And I wonder if that's the case. So what, in different domains of a young person's life, there is a danger that a young person who's grown up and has never been aware of any difficulty with providing financially might come to take for granted the fact that, well, if I just do high school, and then I'll be able to always provide for my family. A young person whose father and mother have remained faithful to each other might just think, that happens naturally. You don't have to. You've got no temptations to resist. And a young person who's benefited from the presence of other families and other contemporaries, friends who are Christians around them, and from elements of a broader Christian culture, might just imagine that's going to always be there. And of course, all those assumptions are wrong. Like, exactly. If you don't work really hard,
exactly,
and either graduate high school and get some further education, or graduate high school and get some vocational training, you're not going to be able to provide for your family. If you don't work at your marriage, and if you're not committed to holiness and faithfulness, your parents might have stayed together, but there's no good reason to think that you will.
So that's where we are at with the adults, I think. We don't have many couples, but those who are there who have had a Christian heritage, I can think of one where when you speak to them, they precisely like I say, they assume their marriage will stay together just like that. Okay, there's no and you see kind of assumption. They have aspects of not being intentional in doing stuff. And sad things in Kenya actually increasing. I told you about the increase of feminism, where men. I speaking to a couple, they have different accounts and they don't know what the other has in the account.
So just backtrack there. So we were talking about the rise of feminism, and even if it's not ideologically articulated,
it's not.
It's there's a kind of, let's call it an unbiblical independent spiritedness among ladies.
That's right.
And perhaps against a cultural background where in the past there's been an unbiblical patriarchalism.
That's right.
So there's a reaction against one form of oppressive, unbiblical relationship in a wrong direction, rather than a centering on scriptural teaching. So you've then got, and the fruit of that is, you gave the example of financial separation. Basically, just no.
And they don't think there's anything wrong with that.
It's like my money and his money.
Yeah, exactly. They don't think there's anything wrong with that, and you're like, wow. And when you start to press and say, look, if a couple is not one, even in this most central area, where else could things be going wrong? But they're like, oh, well, one guy just said, oh, we'll definitely stay together. We're not. There's no question there. There's just an assumption. Things just, my parents are together. It's all going to be fine. Yes. On the other side, we've had issues where children, people who have come from Christian households, discover that their parents, there was some hypocrisy somewhere, and they get very bitter or begin, not would I say distrust the Christian faith, but when we start talking about what the biblical norm is, they're just like, you have no idea how
How busted
a
it
lot
is.
of, yeah, exactly,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, that's interesting because, I mean, just to go back to the financial thing, it's I've known situations where really the issue there is it reflects a lack of trust.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
And
yeah,
and
yeah,
how much they say,
yeah,
we're going to stay together, we're going to stay together.
mm,
It's one thing to say it, it's another thing to say it with your finances. And
indeed.
there's this underlying sense of uncertainty. Well, look, if I give her my money, so to
Mm,
speak,
mm.
which is a bizarre thing to think about if you're married, because
Yeah.
think of the marriage vows, right?
There's a-
But if somebody's
True.
thinking, if I give her that and then she goes off with another man and it gets split 50-50, I'll have lost out. And so there's this underlying lack of trust in the relationship, which then generates, in the West it will be prenups and so
Yeah,
on,
yeah, 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 yeah.
or at least kind of separate accounting. And you think, okay, so the solution to that is not, okay, yeah, maintain separate accounts to protect yourselves. It's to address the attitude that generates the
Exactly.
underlying lack of
Yeah,
trust.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
like, do you realize what marriage is?
Exactly,
And
exactly,
and
exactly.
of course, when you start talking like that, uh, you pretty soon end up with a version of the conversation Jesus had with his disciples, where they end up replying,
Well,
"Well, if that's the
it's
deal, then
who then can?
then who can get married?" And Jesus
Yeah,
is like, "Yeah, not many
yeah,
people."
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Not
yeah,
at
yeah,
all
yeah.
wanting to discourage marriage,
Indeed,
but
indeed,
pointing
indeed,
to
indeed.
the immense demands that it makes on a man and a woman's character.
Mm.
So here you are, you're in this interesting situation then, because on the one hand, you and I are wanting to encourage young people of any age, actually, to aspire to marriage, and not just to go through life with a bunch of either no relationships or fleeting or uncommitted relationships. But you should get married. If you think this is the
Mm.
lady for you, then you should get married. On the other hand, you know that for them to do that will place on them intensely high demands in terms of their maturity, their faithfulness,
Yeah.
their
Mm.
integrity and trustworthiness,
Mm.
their conscientiousness and hard work. So it all tracks back to discipleship of people before and in the early years of their marriage,
Yeah,
correct?
indeed, indeed, indeed. So for us, that's meant. I touched on already. Repeating what the biblical view is. We want the word to ground and shape the people of God, and that is whenever the temptations or inklings to think otherwise come, that at least there's some background knowledge of what God in His holy word has written. Then, secondly, for us, I think without wanting to be proud or boastful, to pray that God would use us to model the things we want to see.
Right.
Right? It's not. I don't think it's accidental. Paul tells Timothy, "Watch your life and doctrine, the two,
Mm.
lip and life, to go together." So we say what the biblical model is, and then we would seek to live it. You touched on something that's been big in Kenya. Say, um, one of the things why women want this kind of unbiblical independence is they've seen oppression of their moms, maybe,
Hmm.
or in grandparents, or they hear how women were treated, and they would tell us, we want nothing to do
Yeah.
with that. Well, the solution, not to completely we also don't want that. We're not commending that, but go the biblical way, and part of showing that is to model that. Say, if again, in terms of discipleship, if you're praying, pray for us that we would live the life that is honorable, pleasing before God, including, by the way, which I've sometimes, it's not an easy thing to pray, including, by the way, being willing to show the people of God, when things go wrong, how you deal with them.
Mm.
Confessing, saying to Rachel sorry, or owning, maybe we've said sorry privately, but something has happened, and owning it publicly. People have no models of that. I once asked, well, I don't know what sermon we were preaching on, just as a starter, who in this year, I think it was this past year, you're kind of somewhere like in July, has either said sorry to someone or had someone say sorry to them, and hardly anyone put up their hand.
Mm.
So just saying, look, we've had this has not been an easy week, but Rachel and I have worked through it, and we've had to say sorry to each other. And people are usually like, wow,
Mm.
just Lord, help us to, in our life and doctrine, to model the things that we would love to see, and we have taught others to have in their marriages.
That's interesting. See, I think
Mm.
in our context, we have, again, a slightly different shape to that. So it uh, it may be in Christchurch and Laresho that there's a very small number of great marriages, like maybe one, the pastor and his wife, and others are the small number of couples are are struggling almost to fix their eyes on that vision at all. I think in our context, we have a far larger number of people.
Indeed, yeah.
And I think the challenge, one way of framing it, is like, how are you going to pick your role models?
Oh, I see. Yeah,
And honestly, so this is the kind of thing that it can be unpopular to say, but I think it probably needs to be said sometimes. Both men and women in different ways sometimes pick unhelpful role models. I'll just say it like that. So, for example, men may be attracted to a vision of masculinity that seems to have very decisive and clear answers and projects an image of strong leadership. And they're feeling the need to embrace that because our culture is so down on masculinity. And some of these are online ministries, or some of them are parachurch ministries, groups outside the church that may be Christian, may not be Christian at all, at least not explicitly. And some men feel attracted to that, and they feel a sense of empowerment, which is not altogether wrong, but it's disordered in the sense that it's not located within a context of a church-centered vision for how men and women are supposed to work together. And I think for ladies, my impression is that however much men talk to each other, privately or in small groups, women talk 5 to 10 times as much.
They do.
Right? And that gives plenty of opportunity to, there's a whole portfolio of advice out there, like a sort of a buffet with every conceivable pastoral food item on it. And the question is, all right, well, how do you encourage women to be discerning about who they're listening to without being unfairly critical of some of the advice they may be hearing? Put it a slightly different way. There is a men's group chat and a ladies' group chat here at All Saints. So members of the church, the ladies chat to each other and they talk about all kinds of things. And my wife mentions some of them to me sometimes. And the men talk about, there's brisket on special offer at Costco, and where can I get my truck fixed? And I need to help with that because I need the brakes on my car fixed. Anybody know anybody you can replace brake pads? But then sometimes there'll be pastoral questions.
Yeah.
Right. And it would be astonishing if all of the advice that was given was wise.
On the groups.
Yes. Just statistically.
Yeah, that's right.
It's extremely likely that some of that advice, though well-intentioned, and though it may work in some contexts, may not be immediately generalizable to all contexts, or may be misunderstood, or it might need to be nuanced or complemented with other biblical pastoral themes. In other words, you can end up in this situation where we have an embarrassment of riches, and some of the riches aren't so rich.
Yeah, I see.
In the end, that comes down to a sense of biblical discernment, perhaps biblical restraint, a willingness to say, I don't know. To pick your source of advice more carefully. And it's interesting. I don't have in mind any specific. People on the ladies and men's group chats might think, what's Pastor Jeffrey talking about? I actually genuinely don't have in mind any specific instances, but it's the kind of thing that if you're a pastor long enough and you hang around with other pastors long enough, you see these sort of things going wrong. And,
you will.
So bad ideas can become viral within a small community quite quickly.
They can.
Right.
They can.
And yeah, those.
So I can think of one small. I don't know this is what you're getting at. So I'm not going to say the name, but you might get a broadly reformed women speaker who on many issues is okay, but they might have something slightly off or could have serious implications, and then it gets shared on the group.
Right. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And initially you had 2 months back when the name was mentioned, you were fine because you generally thought that's fine. Then you hear something that's been said and the way it's being spun, and they're happily sharing it with other people, and you're like, oh, now I have to dial back. and hang on, but you said this person is fine.
Yes.
And already it's gone.
Yeah, and that's true of men and women. And I think it's also the case that we tend to. There are two other factors that tend to encourage that kind of thinking. The first is that if it's online, you don't really know them, even when you think you do. So your sources of instruction, teaching, you're getting a curated version of who this person is, with the result that you can end up with, at the very best, oversimplified lifestyle instruction. The other problem is we tend to do our thinking in black and white categories. So either this person is good or bad. And got news for you: mostly human beings are a mixture. and but that if you combine those two things, that you get. You don't get the whole of a person. You get elements of doctrinal or pastoral or discipleship wisdom, which may be more or less wise. And what people will tend to do is take all or nothing. It's like, this is a good person. Oh, great. And 8 out of 10 things they say is, that's really helpful. You probably heard your pastor talking about that at some point. And the other two, it's like, there's a head scratcher. And so as a pastor, I tell you what it feels like. You know this yourself. What it feels like is constant firefighting.
Yes.
Because you're always, oh my goodness, they heard what? From who?
Just not that one, but everything.
Everything else is great. But
yeah.
And so there's something valuable about, so how do you fix that? I don't think there's an easy fix. I was talking about this with Larson Hicks a couple of weeks ago. He's an elder at one of our CREC churches in Huntsville, Alabama. There's a podcast called Red Pill Addiction. You can listen to that if you've not listened to it. But one of the things that came out of that was that the inescapable biblical case for your church's pastoral input. And it's not because your pastors might never get anything wrong. Statistically, I as a pastor and you as a pastor are likely to get things wrong as often as the guy whose Facebook group you're in, or the lady who you're listening to the conference talks that she gave to some women's conference somewhere. But the difference is, you actually know your pastor.
That's right.
You're getting a far less curated version of them, which allows you to sift wisely as a community through the complexities of issues of discipleship. Because in the end, what happens in these alternative communities is it's very often like aphoristic, simple, one-liners, right? Which can just, even if they're right as far as they go, they don't go very far, and they need to be nuanced. Whereas in a community of people whom you actually know, you see the relational, lived out, situational elements, and you can probe and interrogate them in greater detail and try and deal with, how do I raise my 2-year-old? How should a married couple deal with the conflicts that they keep running into? And let me tell you, you're not going to do those things well by referring to a one-liner somewhere. Even the best of books tend to introduce visions for life and doctrinal frameworks that need to be worked on as they're lived out. So I realize there's a lot of stuff there.
For us, I think, it's been wonderful actually in terms of okay, so how is Christ Church Glasgow different? We have children for the whole service. We don't do even more historic denominations like Anglicans in Nairobi. You go to the cathedral, immediately you get in, there's a children's church and there is a youth church, so people get split up. So we have everyone together. We have children communing. We have the Lord's Supper every week. And then the one that has been one of the hottest issues is only those who are elders or training to be elders lead the service. So if that means only men. And at the beginning, and even till now, there's still a bit of pushback, but wonderfully, just picking up on your point, there's something about them seeing, like Rachel and myself, we've had comments about, it doesn't just mean, in Kenyan culture, it meant the man basically, everything revolves around him. He's like the center of the universe and doesn't have to exert any effort, especially if they have any kind of money or wealth. Zero effort on his part. I've paid for the house. I've paid for the kids. I don't need to do anything else. Okay, I'm like I'm an ATM and that's it. Rather than being involved and giving and making decisions and speaking up when you need to. And we've had one or two comments that like, oh, so that's what it looks like. Rachel can say something, I suggest something, and it's not just a done deal. What about this? And I listen. And when those things happen in public, people are usually taken aback.
Yes,
that's what
yes,
it looks like,
yes,
as opposed to what we had assumed it looks like.
So that strikes me as fascinating on a couple of levels, because firstly, it speaks to the function of liturgical leadership and liturgy generally. And the second thing I'll come to in a second is it speaks to how a husband leading his wife can function alongside a high level of mutual engagement and discussion. So maybe come to that in a second, but I want to say a point about the liturgical thing, because I think this is more self-contained. The general principle, liturgy imitates and provides a model for life. So this is certainly true in terms of the structure of our liturgy. The structure of the liturgy is gospel shaped. God calls us into his presence. We confess our sins. We're shaped by the word. We commune with him. We're blessed and sent out into the world. That's the shape of our service, and actually all historic orders of worship that anybody's ever written down and thought about. But also the individual elements and who leads them. So the reason I wear a white robe on the Lord's Day and not now is because on the Lord's Day in worship, I'm taking upon a significant aspect of my role to speak in the name of Christ liturgically, and it kind of matters that I do it.
Exactly. I agree.
And what that speaks to then is your point about how Christchurch in Loresho views the place of leaders in worship. These should be those whom God has given the calling to lead the church, which means elders, perhaps trainee elders, and the pastor yourself. And you can then reverse engineer that, because you can then ask yourself, okay, if I'm in this church, wherever your church is, okay, who am I being taught to imitate? You're being taught to imitate the people who are leading you in worship.
Indeed.
Look at your church. Take a look at your church. And you've got to either decide, okay, my goodness, that is who I'm being taught to imitate. And, you've got the worst case scenario, which is part of my background from 25 years ago, is, you've got the kids in the 12 to 14-year-old youth group doing drama sketches during what should be a worship service. It's going back quite a long time. Before I was a pastor, I hasten to add. You're being taught to imitate a kind of childish attitude to life, which is exactly what the adults in the church then end up like. Or men and women leading indiscriminately in worship with no awareness of the effects of that. The effects of that are actually to model a certain kind of leadership. So if you're in a church like that, I want to say, okay, it shouldn't prompt hasty action. It should prompt thoughtful consideration about what am I being encouraged to think here. The flip side is, if you're in a church where you already have good reason to trust that it's, broadly speaking, being led in the right way, you are also being told and taught whom you should be taking lessons from.
Yeah, that's right.
The leaders of the church have thought through and decided very carefully who should lead you before the throne of the living God. You might like to think, are they the people who I should be trying to model myself on Monday through Saturday as well? Because that's just how liturgy is supposed to work.
Indeed, absolutely, I agree. And as you say, people start noticing who's at the front and wanting to, in some way, emulate or live a bit like them. And then
that's healthy.
Yeah, you want that.
Yes,
you want to be intentional with that. We've had comments, why, and I'm glad people are listening. Why why is it not all the men who? If it's men, then why is it not all the men? Well, because you need to be careful. The list in 1 Timothy and Titus is not just anybody.
Yeah, not all the men are absolutely exemplary, and they could be good guys, like great guys, the kind of guys that you'd are grown up, mature, wise, thoughtful Christians, and yet there is something that is extremely weighty that is a responsibility of those who have uppercase or lowercase l leadership roles in the church. And that's not supposed to be sort of elitism, and not a theological or pastoral elitism. It's simply to try and take seriously, as the Bible does, that leading in worship is a big deal. who you follow in life is
Is
a
a
big
big deal.
deal,
It
right?
is.
And
It
those two
is.
things are not unrelated,
Yeah, that's the point.
right?
That's
They're
the point.
not. Anybody who thinks that what we do in worship is unrelated to what we do in life needs to think again.
Exactly.
And so the inescapable conclusion is that there is guidance there about who you should be following, and you don't get that from non-ecclesial sources of pastoral guidance, however valuable they are, and many of them are potentially valuable, but you're not getting the same thing.
Yeah.
I want to pick up what you said about the relationship that you and Rachel have. I've described Mrs. Chelashaw, Rachel Chelashaw, who I hope she won't mind my doing this in front of everybody. But she was raised by missionary parents.
Indeed.
Madagascar, they
So
were serving in.
latterly Madagascar. She was actually born in South Africa, but the folks also worked in. Rachel's dad is a surgeon, surgeon. Then Gabon for a little while, although there was issues there with the country. Then for the last 20 years before they retired in Madagascar.
Right. So she's seen a lot.
She has.
She's tough as nails. She's extremely calm,
very
wise,
incredible.
and thoughtful. She's about the least reactionary person you could meet. And so it's fascinating to hear you describe how you relate to her. So again, a bit of context here. American Reformed evangelicals are walking a road of rediscovering biblical masculinity, and it turns out it's a pretty bumpy road, and there are some turnings that lead down blind alleys and off cliffs, right?
So you need to be careful,
right? Because like we're a post-feminist society, so we've now tried feminism for long enough to see the catastrophes it produces in everything from women's mental health in the workplace to the effects of the family tension produced by sort of two career, two income aspiration, the effects of that on the children and increased divorce rates and so on, the denigration of marriage, the delaying of marriage, the downgrading of childbearing and child rearing as a high calling. So we've tried that experiment, and people are, not we, but our society has tried
becoming
it,
aware of,
and even mainstream secular society is becoming aware of it. So now the church, which was in fairness ahead of the curve, the church has been saying this is a mistake for a while, but now there are more and more and more and more people who are ready to accept the church's message that we need to find another way of doing this. So the things that the church has been saying over the years are getting a much more receptive audience among men who want to be godly, mature, strong, faithful Christian men, husbands, fathers, and so on. But whenever you've got such a large community of people doing things like that, and whenever you've got such a disparate set of sources of guidance, some of which, frankly, the financial incentives and the monetization systems, the business model is an online one which incentivizes a certain mode of engagement, you're going to have a distribution of outcomes, right? And some of the outcomes are, frankly, baptized misogyny, and the kind of patriarchalism which is not biblical patriarchalism. Patriarchy means father rule, obviously. Fathers are to lowercase r rule in their homes. They're the ones who take responsibility for leading their families. But there's a way of doing that which is domineering.
Indeed.
And which fails to hear and respond appropriately to the reality that God has placed wisdom elsewhere than inside your head, sir. So you and Rachel, I mean, you're telling me offline, I'm going to embarrass you now. One of the people in your church, when you asked, who his role models were, the only person he could think of as a family role model was you and Rachel. And you'd expected him to say, "Oh, my uncle or my father," and it was like none of them said that. They couldn't think of anybody. If they could think of anybody, it was you. And I know you well enough to have seen you and Rachel and to come to admire you both. So can you talk through how your relationship looks when you're clearly your wife is respectful towards you, she loves you, she's ready to follow you, she's ready to submit to you, but how does that look in the day-to-day and in practice?
So the best example I can give is that whenever we've had interactions with the public, with other people, and their discussions, I want to be on. I want to confess. It's not. It has not. It has not always been thus, or I'm not always excelled in this. But I want to,
Your aspirations are,
yeah,
yeah.
to listen to Rachel and to express, not pretend or for humility, but genuinely when it's an insight I hadn't either considered, or
Mm,
the idea. Rachel's got excellent ideas and excellent things, and I was like, goodness, that we should go that way, and to mean that when people can see it, and then to follow through and do it.
mm,
Okay,
mm,
so they're like, oh, it wasn't just, we know Kip is leading, but honestly, that interaction there is good. And then the one I've sensed there's a lot of, not resistance, but people are like, wow, is that really possible? Is this idea of saying sorry to each other?
hmm
Is this
That's
idea of
fascinating.
owning something, owning something where you either were wrong, or you tried something, it hasn't worked, or you were absolutely certain that this is the way we should go, and Rachel had said something different and it didn't work. Just people are usually thrown by that. Again, I'm not excellent at it. I think it's a thing I'm learning to get better at. But just to try and model to the congregation, you know what? As you just put it, we don't actually realize it. You're not the gold standard for wisdom.
Hmm, hmm.
Okay, and that means there are times you will have to own up and say, guys, actually 2 months ago Rachel had said we do this, and I said no, and I've had to say sorry, and now we're actually going to take that path.
Right, right, right.
So just trying to, not forcing it, not looking for it, but when it's obvious, don't cover it up. Just
Yeah,
own
yeah,
it.
yeah.
Own it.
So I find
Publicly.
myself thinking there's an element of this where uh, it goes back to these oversimplifications again, the pastoral oversimplifications. So you've got a man and the woman, they're married, husband and wife. If they disagree, the man has the casting vote.
Mm.
It's like, okay, that's just such a grotesque oversimplification of how a relationship should work.
Mm.
And it actually allows the man to be weak, because it means the man doesn't have to actually think anymore
And engage.
and engage and
Yeah, yeah.
listen and persuade his perhaps quite articulate and more intelligent than him wife. It requires more courage, more manliness, more glad assumption of sacrificial responsibility,
Indeed,
all of
indeed,
those things,
indeed,
to
indeed.
stop and listen to the concerns of your wife as she's expressed them,
Mm.
and then to talk back with her in such a way that she realizes that you share those concerns
Indeed.
to the degree that they are her concerns and she's your wife, and that you've taken them into account. Because what ought to be the case is that we've all got all these different concerns, and perhaps we weight them differently. So,
Mm-hmm.
I feel these things more keenly,
Yeah, yeah.
but I recognize that Nicole feels these things more keenly.
Mm.
And I'm thinking, okay, how do I take into account her strength of feeling? It's not just by doing what she wants. That's as much of a cop out as saying,
Exactly.
I'll do what I want. But it's to talk and to listen, and
Mm. Mm.
then to navigate the actual conversation that's involved to the point where Nicole realizes, let's suppose we're going to take a course of action in some practical thing. Should we spend quite a lot of money for us all to go home to England this Christmas? Okay, there's a
Yes.
practical thing.
Indeed.
Now we're in the same place on that, but let's suppose we're in a different place. The reason we're in a different place is because we've got all these motives and we're weighting them differently.
Exactly.
And I've got to get to a point where I can express to her what we should do in a way that reassures her that I have taken into account what she feels.
Absolutely. I can. Yeah.
And if she's
Absolutely.
wrong,
Yeah.
or if I think she's wrong, I need to find a way of saying so, which is sensitive
It is. It is.
and
Yeah.
and not just boorish and domineering
Mm.
and dismissive. And one of my concerns about some aspects of the teachings that some guys are swallowing, is that it actually makes them less manly.
It does.
It makes them less able to be
Completely.
great husbands.
Completely.
Because they don't have to
You're
do
not
that.
engaging.
Yeah.
You're not spend. The key point. You're not spending time with her just to understand it and understand where she's at. Understand why that intensity, and can I kind of inhabit that space and then be
Yes.
able to respond to it. One thing you could pray for us just on that, while I still think about it. Currently, because of venue issues, a lot of stuff is happening in the home, and it's not happened recently, but towards was it before Easter? it was really getting quite tiring, even as disrupting schooling. Now, in Kenyan culture, it is rude not to, especially for a pastor, not to just have people, if people come, not to host them. But it was really beginning to take a toll on the family and Rachel and so on. And I feel the pressure because sometimes, okay, people, the comment you might hear whispers are like, Kip is doing that. Pastor Kip is doing that because he's married to a white lady. Okay.
Right. He
And
won't let us into his home
this is it. And
because
so you start
right.
feeling, no, I need to be known amongst the Kenyans as, I need to be known in this culture as hot, like everyone else. So that's been a thing we've struggled with. I want to ask prayer for. And like now for Sundays, I've got to the point where courage and actually trying to be sensitive to where I just say, guys, you guys need to go home.
Mm-hmm.
You have to go home because, and it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Yeah.
We've been hosting people from 8 o'clock. It's our home. I can see my office and needs a bit of time.
Yeah.
And just owning that without and siding with Rachel and the kids over perceptions and impressions that people will have.
Right.
I think that is leadership. I'm going to be the buffer. I don't mind what the culture is telling us. I want these guys behind me, Rachel and the kids, to know that I'm for them.
Yes.
And that's what leadership. I'll take the hit in that way.
Yeah. So I think that's a fascinating example. It's much better than my example, which was very easy for us to work
No,
out.
it's okay.
Like,
It's because I'm praying. It's an issue I'm praying about.
Yeah. Well, you keep giving us prayer requests, so people will be making notes of this, mental notes.
Yeah.
But just to clarify what I think is so helpful about that, you've got a genuine issue of where you both, in a sense, want to do the same thing. We both want to have a family which is doing the best we can of nurturing and nourishing ourselves as a family
Indeed.
before the Lord, and also serving our church community. And it's just that you and Rachel feel different pressures to different degrees. She's feeling the emotional exhaustion and the impingement on the children's schooling, which is more her responsibility.
Indeed.
You're feeling, yeah, but I don't want us to be discredited in the eyes of the very people we're trying to serve because of their cultural assumptions. Well, are those cultural assumptions valid? To a certain extent. So how do you navigate that? And it will be so easy for you just to say, "Submit, woman."
Yes.
And especially because you could dress it up with stuff about sacrificing for the
This
gospel.
is the thing. I listened to a sermon. I was reading through the gospel, and Jesus, in Mark 1, where at the end of the day, after healing Peter's mother-in-law, and the people come to the house, and he heals everyone. You're like, maybe Rachel, that would be the temptation.
Yeah.
Come on.
And you can dress it up as, this is sacrifice for the gospel, and this is what we came out to Nairobi for. And so your wife then ends up, precisely because she wants to be humble and submissive towards you as a godly wife, she ends up just in an emotional mess and frustrated and confused and more alienated from you because you've shown leadership. It's like, that's not. Whereas for you to say, look, let me work through this so that I feel as keenly as you do the things that you feel. Then you'll know that I do that. Yeah. So it requires this relational openness and transparency to each other.
And remarkably, I've seen in small, it's been wonderful, actually beautiful. There's been ways in which you do that, and I think this is something couples husbands especially hear, how the wives tend to then, I don't know, God gives the ability to do more than you actually expected in other areas. Mm-hmm. They see the commitment and willingness to go, we're together on this. We're one. I don't want to fight you. I see you. You've been giving from 8 o'clock in the morning, sometimes before, late last night until it's 3 o'clock, and I want to recognize that, and I want to feel that. And then in other areas, they're willing to then give, and even the kids see, okay, sacrifice is modeled like this, giving is modeled like this, that empowers us, enables us to give in other ways more, and it's been beautiful. I've seen Rachel kind of get strength in other ways when they see that you really want to listen and stand with them. Encourages them.
Kip, I'm very grateful to you. You've really helped us open up some topics, which I think, just to sketch back over them, whether it's teenagers aspiring to be marriage material, maybe we didn't talk enough about that. I should say a word about that in a second, or the issues in relationships between men and women. It's fascinating to me how you're seeing a Kenyan version of precisely the same human growing pains.
Indeed.
Right? And all of us are just growing towards greater maturity in Christ. And it's tremendously illuminating to me to see these same things. Just that theme I didn't pick up. One of the points that emerges from this, the situation you've got with 100 and something children. to instill in them a sense that we should be doing the same with our young people and children. Your goal should be to be striving to be the most godly, mature, um, capable of providing, capable of serving your husband or wife you can possibly be, so that you're basically becoming great Christian marriage material, right? Basically, I mean, let's oversimplify it to a degree or two. Become great Christian marriage material with all that implies, not a shrunk down version of masculinity,
Yes.
not a shrunk down version of femininity, where, and in both cases, you'd be missing off the things that are harder for you to do personally, but seeking to become the rounded, mature man or woman. And as you're doing so, you will be inculcating the desire to find the godly man or the
Exactly.
godly woman.
Yeah, it feeds
Your own aspirations for yourself start to feed
It does.
the
It does.
aspirations that you are looking for
It does.
in a husband or wife.
It does. We do a simple thing, and I've even done it with older people, and they really get upset. I was at a party with some of my dad's friends, and I said we're going to do the food time for food. We're going to do the food this way, and I said we're going to have the ladies first, and especially those who my mom's age and older, then those who are nursing mothers, and then after that the men. The men got really upset. The men got really upset. One of my dad's friends told me, you don't in Kenyan culture, you don't let the older guys, men, go second or third. They have to go first. I want to model the way in which men give,
Yeah.
lay down for others.
Ruth chapter 2, Boaz gave to her bread and wine.
This is it.
Yeah.
And then for the young guys, whenever we have any food stuff, you guys helped us have an Easter feast. I say to them, you young men, you young men, I say, should go last. And the other day, a lady said to me, we were having a study day, then we came to lunch, and the men actually did that. And one of them said, Kip, you're training these men well. So she's obviously, I don't know, she probably not noticed it, but now she's like, wow, we're being served. And then you want to look for that as you look for someone.
Yeah, so she's not going to marry some guy who's boorish and
This is
insists
it.
on being
She's
first.
Like,
Yeah.
oh, I can see you've trained these guys. And she was saying it jokingly because they're ladies, no, you go first, or we'll serve you. I'm like, great. That now she's attuned to that. She's attuned to So
she's not going to accept the advances of a man who's got a big 4-wheel drive.
Yeah, so it's like,
if he's not godly,
they're serving and they know what they want to an extent, but they can also serve. This is good.
Yeah.
So it runs both ways.
Great.
Yeah.
Kip, thank you for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you found this helpful. I found it, as you can probably tell from my reactions in this conversation, tremendously illuminating. It is fascinating to me how you're in Nairobi, we're in Fort Worth. You may be listening to this in Fort Worth or possibly Nairobi, but quite likely somewhere else. And I suspect the very same issues are relevant to you. If you found it helpful, God be praised. If you know other people who find it helpful, please like, share, do whatever you like, subscribe to the podcast, and pass on the good news. But Kip, it's been a pleasure having you here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And those of you guys listening, Lord bless you. Bye for now.